All right, well, we're getting into Acts 15 this morning. I ran across a story in the LA Times recently of a married couple by the name of Simon and Shauna Taub. Now, I doubt you're familiar with the couple, but the story stands out for this reason. As they were approaching a divorce, the story goes, the only thing they could seem to agree on was that neither of them wanted to leave the house they were living in. And so the couple went through with the divorce, but both of them refused to move out of their New York home. And so to solve the matter, the court ordered a sand-colored wall be built right through the middle of the living room. Simon can only get to the dining room by going up a neighbor's outside stairs, stepping over a balcony, and climbing through a window. Shauna has easier access to the second floor, but she complains that Simon still makes her life a nightmare by yelling, banging on walls, and turning off her heat when it's cold since he's the only one with the thermostat. They each vow to stay in the house until the other moves, but it doesn't look like that's going to happen anytime soon. As we look at a story like that, one of the things that becomes clear, maybe not to that degree, is this. When we're in a disagreement with someone, we can begin to act irrationally. That when we face conflict with another person, it's almost as if who we are falls away and we respond and we react in ways we would never respond or react to another person. And the issue is, it's that conflict is everywhere, and so it's an issue we're constantly battling. There's conflict at home with our spouses and our kids. Conflicts at work, conflicts with friends, that even in the church, there are conflicts you're going to experience with other people. And so we're just living with this reality that this is a difficult part of being a human being, having conflict with other people, but also living with the reality that we will experience some degree of conflict everywhere. And so since conflict is such an inevitable thing for us to face, how do we handle conflict well as followers of Jesus? That's the question at the heart of Acts 15, 36 to 41. One of the things I love about Acts is this. It does not present an idealized version of the church. That Luke does recount the high points, that there are days when thousands of people are saved, there are days when thousands are baptized, there are days when churches are planted and new elders are installed, and there are days like the day in Acts 15, 36 through 41, where two pillars of the early church can't seem to get along. And Luke shows us both to show us an accurate picture of what life in the church is like. So when we experience conflict in the church, what do we do? Sadly, one of the things about our current cultural situation that makes this difficult is this. It's possible in our day and age with all of the churches we have in this city and this region that as soon as you face some kind of conflict in the church, it's possible to just leave that one and find a new one thinking the grass will be greener there. Stories told of a man who was stranded on a deserted island in the Pacific for years. One day a boat came sailing into view. The man frantically waved down the captain, and the boat landed on the beach, and the captain got out to greet the stranded man. After a while, the captain asked the castaway, "What are those 3 huts you've built?" The stranded man replied, "Well, the first hut there is my house." "Well, what's the second hut?" the captain said. "I built that for my church." "Well, what's the third hut?" And the man looked sullen and downcast, and he said to the captain, "That's where I used to go to church." And so all of us have probably had, that's a dumb joke, that's a preacher joke. I get one of those every once in a while. So how do we handle, now I want to be clear about what I am and am not saying in this sermon. We've talked a lot about unity in the church the past few weeks, and to be clear again, there are times to leave a church. There's times when the leadership is bad and the culture is toxic and you've done everything that you can do and it's not a place where you're going to be able to get closer to Jesus. There are churches you need to leave. There are moments to leave them. This sermon is not about those situations. That would be a different sermon with a different text. But if you are a part of a church, you are going to experience some measure of conflict. So what do we do? Verse 36. And after some days, Paul said to Barnabas, "Let us return and visit the brothers in every city where we proclaim the word of the Lord and see how they are." If you were with us last week, you'll remember this church council was called to answer the question once and for all, what's necessary for salvation? And the council determined faith in Jesus alone. That's what saves someone, not circumcision, not the law. It's faith in Jesus. And they send Paul and Barnabas back to Antioch to let the church know this is what the council decided. And when they arrive, there's celebration. They receive this decision of the council as good news. And Luke tells us that Paul and Barnabas sit tight for about 2 months ministering to the church there. Eventually, though, Paul has the idea, let's go back to the churches that we started a few years ago and see how things are going. We can encourage the believers there. We can train the leaders. Let's go make sure our work was not in vain and that those churches are solid. Now, as Paul makes this suggestion to Barnabas, there's a little disagreement in how they're going to do this. Verse 37 and 38. Now, Barnabas wanted to take with him John called Mark, but Paul thought best not to take with them one who had withdrawn from them in Pamphylia and had not gone with them to the work. And just like that, over this issue of who to bring with them on this trip, Paul and Barnabas find themselves engaged in conflict. Now, before we look at how they respond, I want to make sure it's clear what's causing the issue here. Barnabas wanted to bring John Mark with them as they went, and Paul wanted to leave him behind because on a previous missionary journey, John Mark had abandoned them. We don't know exactly why, but in Acts 13:13, we're told, now Paul and his companions set sail from Paphos and came to Perga in Pamphylia, and John left them and returned to Jerusalem. Again, we're not told why Mark left Paul and Barnabas, but it's clear from Paul's language in Acts 15, he takes this as a pretty serious offense. And it's not hard to imagine a reason John Mark might have left them. Maybe he was homesick. Maybe the work was harder than he thought it was going to be. Maybe as they began to face persecution, which we read about in the earlier chapters of Acts, he just didn't have the resolve yet to be able to face those things as a young man. And so as Paul and Barnabas are on this missionary journey, John Mark abandons them. Now Paul no longer trusts him. And the question is, what do we do with John Mark as we leave on what comes to be known as the second missionary journey of Paul, which we're about to get into here in Acts 15. Both men want to do the same thing. Let's go encourage the churches we started. The difference is, who do we bring with us? Now, there's times when you have conflict with someone and there's a clear right and wrong in the situation. Someone sins against you, you sin against someone else, and in those instances, resolving the conflict really boils down to the one who offended the other person, the one who sinned against the other person, going and apologizing and making that relationship right. But what do you do when you're in a conflict and there's not a clear right and wrong? And this is part of what we begin to see here in Acts chapter 15. What happens when your conflict is not based on right and wrong, black and white, the truth that we see revealed in Scripture? What happens when your conflict with someone else is a preference issue? When it boils down to you just have different personalities? It's not hard to understand why Paul and Barnabas are responding in the way they're responding. Barnabas' nickname is the son of encouragement. He's the kind of person, and you need these in the church, who refuses to leave anyone behind, who will always give someone a second chance. And actually, when Paul came to faith after he had been persecuting Christians, Barnabas was one of the only Christians who would welcome him in, while everyone else continued to hold him at arm's length. Again, you need these kind of people in the church who are always on the lookout for the one who is hurting, for the one who's in trouble, for the one who needs some encouragement. And because this is how Barnabas was wired, he says, let's bring John Mark and give him another chance. It doesn't hurt that John Mark was also Barnabas' cousin. And you can imagine he didn't want to go to Thanksgiving that year explaining to the family why they left John Mark behind. The impression you get of Paul from reading Paul's letters is that's not how Paul's wired. That Paul is someone who has a clear picture of the mission that needs to be accomplished. There's work to be done for Jesus. And Paul is the kind of person who's going to throw himself into that work. And if that means some people get left behind because they're half-heartedly into it, they're 1 foot in, 1 foot out of the mission that we've been given, Paul is okay with that if that means that the gospel advances further or more quickly or more people are coming to faith, and the church needs these kind of people as well. We need the kind of people who will constantly turn our attention back to the work that God has given us to do. Yes, there's all these needs that people have, but we've been put in this city to preach the gospel, to invite people to respond, and for all of the care that people need, we still have to be about that work. And a church functions well when there's some Barnabases in the church who really care about people, when there's some Pauls in the church who are focused on the mission that we have to accomplish, but it shouldn't surprise us that those two kinds of people struggle to get along a lot of the time. Because foundationally, what is most important to them in this given situation is just different. Barnabas wants to make sure everyone is cared for who wants it. Paul wants to make sure the gospel work that Jesus gave him to do is accomplished. And they both wanted the same thing. Let's encourage these churches. But something else was most important to both of them as they thought about how do we accomplish this work. And so as we think about how to resolve conflicts with one another in these gray areas where there's not a clear right and wrong, one of the things we're reminded of here is this, is that one of the best things you can do when you're facing conflict is take a step back and ask the question, what is the desire driving me in this situation that the person I'm in conflict with is frustrating? What's the thing that I want that the person I'm mad at or the person I'm frustrated with is stopping from happening? Because before we can resolve conflict, we have to understand what are the desires driving us in any situation. This is the point that James makes in James 4. What causes quarrels and what causes fights among you? Is it not this, that your passions are at war within you? You desire and do not have, so you murder. You cover and cannot obtain, so you fight and quarrel. You do not have because you do not ask. And James makes the point that the root cause of most conflict is this, is that we have desires within us, good and bad, that when those desires are not satisfied because another person has become an obstacle to satisfying that desire, it tends to create conflict. Author Ken Sande succinctly defines conflict in this way. Conflict is a difference in opinion or purpose that frustrates someone's goals or desires. Think back to Paul and Barnabas in Acts 15. What does Paul want? He wants to visit these churches, he wants to preach the gospel, and he wants to do it as efficiently and quickly as possible because there is a lot of work to do, and he only has a limited amount of time on this earth. Barnabas also wants to encourage these churches, but he also wants to make sure that those who have a need, that those who need a second chance, that those who need a little encouragement never feel left out of the people of God. And so even though they want the same thing, there's something different driving them. Could Barnabas' plan backfire and John Mark abandon them again? That could happen, but it's a risk that Barnabas is willing to take. Again, Paul and Barnabas both have differing desires, neither of which seem wrong. But those competing desires are in the way of the other person getting what they want. You see how that happens? Again, if you're going to be someone who handles conflict well, especially conflict in the church, one of the first things we have to be able to do is take a step back and ask, what is the desire driving me in this? What do I want? And what is this person I'm frustrated with keeping me from? Christian counselor David Pallison puts it this way. He uses the context of marriage, but I think it works for relationships across the board. I've yet to meet a couple locked in hostility and the accompanying fear, self-pity, hurt, self-righteousness, who really understood and reckoned with their motives. James 4, 1-3 teaches that cravings underlie conflict. Why do you fight? It's not because my wife or my husband. It's because of something in me. Couples who see what rules them. Cravings for affection or attention, power or vindication, control, comfort, or a hassle-free life are able to repent, to find God's grace made real to them, and to learn how to make peace when they understand the root cause of their conflict. Again, to persevere in Christian unity when life together is hard, we have to be able to identify what is driving us. Dr. Robert Jones, who's a Christian counselor, provides us with 3 questions to try and identify that what he calls inordinate desire that's within all of us. He says if you're trying to figure out what is driving you as a human being, ask this. 1, what desires consume me the most? And with that, when your mind's on autopilot, where do your daydreams go? What do you think about getting? What does life look like as you allow your mind to wander? That typically that's a helpful way of understanding the desires that are driving us. Secondly, he says, ask the question, is there something you're willing to sin in order to get? And if the answer is yes, if we're being honest, that's probably a desire that is driving you. If I'm willing to be disobedient to Jesus to get this thing, that's a powerful desire at work in my heart and my mind. And thirdly, he says, do you sin when you don't get something in particular? He says, look at your life and ask, where are my emotions the biggest? Where do I react the strongest? Where does it seem like my reaction to a situation doesn't match the reality of what I'm dealing with? That's typically a good way to identify, again, what's driving me? What do I want? And as I identify that, I'm recognizing this is probably going to be the source of conflict in my life because there are going to be people I encounter in the church, at work, at home, who keep me from getting this thing in my mind. However, beyond identifying what that desire is in us, there are some biblical ways we can pursue resolution and restoration when we experience conflict in the church. Because as followers of Jesus, we are called to seek peace and unity, especially within the church body. Again, if one of Jesus' final prayer requests on the night before he died was, God, I pray that my people would be one, then unity is something as followers of Jesus we have to pursue as those who are being conformed into his image. Again, what do we do when we find ourselves in the midst of conflict? Tony Merida, who's a pastor in our church planting network, has written a short, I think, really helpful, really practical book. If you're struggling with conflict, it's called Gospel-Centered Conflict Resolution. It's 75 pages. You can read it in an afternoon. And I found it incredibly helpful this week as I was processing the conflicts in my own life that are there right now. And he says when you find yourself in the midst of the conflict, there's a handful of things you should always do. The first being this: we have to look at ourselves. Before we do anything else, before we confront someone, it's always worth asking, am I seeing this problem clearly? And am I seeing what I'm contributing to the issue? Again, if you're in a conflict right now, this should be your first move, because typically here's what happens. When we don't see how we're contributing to a problem, we begin to put all the blame on the other person, and it begins to change the way we think about the other person. Because as we let them shoulder all the blame, we begin to feel superior. We begin to grow bitter or resentful. We begin to make assessments about their motives. We lack love toward them and maybe even want to harm them in some way. And so again, if I'm coming to a conflict, maybe there's a face in your mind right now of an issue you're struggling with, and your posture toward that person is hard-heartedness, is bitterness, is resentment. It's worth taking a step back and asking, what am I contributing to this problem, and am I seeing it clearly? Because until I can feel good things for that person, not that it's easy, it's going to be difficult for me to want the best for them, to want the best for me, and I want to see this relationship restored. Second, Tony says, once you've assessed your own motives, you need to ask this: is this just a minor offense? People have bad days. Sometimes somebody says something to you, and you even know, like, they don't normally say stuff like this. They don't normally do stuff like this. That there are instances where there could be conflict in your life, but as you look at it, you just recognize, you know what, this really isn't that big of a deal. And it's amazing how much conflict the church experiences over issues that are relatively minor, and people just won't let them go. Tom Rainer, who's a researcher, particularly researching the American church, has had plenty of opportunities to step into church conflicts, and he writes about how seemingly trivial many of these conflicts that he has to step into are. He writes of the church that was ready to split over the length of the worship pastor's beard. He writes of the church that was coming to blows over whether or not to have a clock in the sanctuary, because when we're worshiping Jesus, we shouldn't be worried about time. Which picture of Jesus to put in the foyer? Whether or not the worship leader should wear shoes when he's on stage. Worship leaders tend to cause a lot of problems. But I will say this, not Joel Kinsey. No issues there. Reading this list, I was like, I'm so happy Joel's here. So none of this is an issue with him. What type of coffee to serve on a Sunday morning? Whether or not it's biblical to serve deviled eggs at the church cookout. Things that have caused massive issues in churches when somebody should have looked at this and said, this is not that big of a deal. People are going to aggravate you, and sometimes it's not intentional. You're wired different than some other people in this church. As this church grows, there's this mix of personalities and preferences, and you're not going to like everyone's personality and preferences. But again, when it's just that, they're not sinning against me. They're not trying to harm me. I just would have done something differently. Is it something that we can let go for the sake of unity in the church? 30 writes, we have to figure out if this is a conflict that requires restoration in order to make it right. There are some more serious conflicts. There are going to be instances of conflict in the church that could dishonor God, that could practically damage relationships, that could disrupt unity in the church. And in these instances, there are likely awkward conversations that need to happen in order for you and the other person to be able to move forward together. Again, one of the best things you can do for the cause of unity in this church is if you think you've harmed someone, go to them and apologize. If you have an issue with someone, go to them and have a conversation. Our church and any church would save itself hours of trouble if we would just be a church committed to having awkward conversations when we need to have them. Because 9 times out of 10, when you have those conversations, you realize the other person didn't mean it in the way that you were taking it. You misunderstood their motives. You misunderstood why they did what they did to you. And it's a quick fix. But when we refuse to open those lines of communication, again, our hearts harden, bitterness, resentment, and all of a sudden this small issue that could have been handled over coffee in 10 minutes has become something threatening to divide the church in a significant way. May that never happen with us. And finally, maybe you just get to a circumstance where you've tried to talk to the person, you've tried to make it right, nothing's going well, and so you bring someone else in to begin to mediate that conflict. Paul did this in his own letters, Philippians 4, 2 and 3. I entreat Euodia and I entreat Syntyche to agree in the Lord. Yes, I ask you also, true companion, help these women who have labored side by side with me in the gospel, together with Clement and the rest of my fellow workers whose names are in the book of life. One of the reasons we have the gift of the church is so that we have others who can help us navigate difficult relationships in the church, who can sit down as an objective third party and hear both people out and hopefully help both of them see things in a way they could not see because they were too close to it. Because of the gift of the church and the family of God, we've got to take advantage of other people in a good way, allowing them to step in, allowing them to speak in when we're facing conflict that we just can't seem to get over. I've mentioned this multiple times for the stage, but for the past year, my wife and I have been in weekly marriage counseling. Things weren't on the rocks, but we knew they could be better. And when you bring a third party in who knows you, who knows your spouse, who knows you, who knows a friend, and they can help you see things from the other person's perspective, it's painful and it's difficult. But I'll say this, our relationship is as solid as it's ever been, but it required going through those hard conversations. I wouldn't trade those frustrating moments when we were talking it out for anything because of what we have now as a couple. That can be true of friendship. That can be true of marriage. That can be true of any relationship that you have. But sometimes you even get through all that and somebody sits with you and it still doesn't work. What do? Well, you do what Paul and Barnabas did, Acts 15, 39 to 41. There arose a sharp disagreement so that they separated from each other. Barnabas took Mark with him and sailed away to Cyprus, but Paul chose Silas and departed, having been commended by the brothers to the grace of the Lord. And he went through Syria and Cilicia, strengthening the churches. Barnabas and Paul just simply come to the decision, you know what, we're not going to agree on this. It might be better if we just part ways and do what God has called us to do, Not in anger, not in hostility, not in cutting the other person off, but in blessing one another, in saying, the Lord be with you, and watch as God works through both sets of missionaries as they go out from this church. Again, one of the reasons Christians should, but we don't always do this, should be able to handle conflict better than the world is because we're always agreed on what the most important thing in any situation is. We want God to be glorified, we want the gospel to be preached, and we want Christ to be lifted up and people to come to know him. And if we're both committed to that as the main thing in this life, then we're not going to drag his name through the mud by engaging in an ugly conflict when we may just need to say to our Christian brother or sister, we're just not going to be close. I love you. I'll pray for good things for you, but we can't work together. Then we're going to be able to give, if we understand what the main thing is, maybe we will be able to lay down some preferences and desires and say, I wouldn't do this way, but if the main thing is glorifying God and preaching the gospel, that's going to happen regardless of if we do it my way or another person's way, and I can lay that down for the greater good. Having the same mission and the same focus allows you to work through a lot of conflicts easily as you're both committed to the same goal in the end. Again, in this situation, it was splitting up that we see was probably the best thing for Paul and Barnabas in this situation, but they still both worked to accomplish the mission that God had given them. The band can come up and we're going to get ready to sing. As we close, I think at the end of the day, the Bible gives us this. As we think about what it means to handle conflict in our lives, that there's plenty of practical advice. Maybe there's times to separate. But constantly what we're being called to is this, to follow the example of Jesus. And even when the way we handle conflict doesn't make sense to the world, we're faithful to Christ as we continue to love and serve difficult people, continue to love and serve those who have become enemies of ours, and continue to love and serve those who don't deserve it in the midst of conflict, because that is what Jesus has done for us. Romans 5:8, one of my favorite verses, but God shows his love for us in this, while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. While we had conflict with Jesus, while we were separated from him, Jesus came to this earth, he died in our place, he pursued us, he called us back to him, and even when he would have been justified to throw his hands up and just remove us from his presence entirely, he continues to come after us. And my guess is you would be amazed at what God might do in your life if that's the approach you took to the difficult people in your life. NPR ran a moving story a few months ago about a father and son that aired on the hit radio show This American Life. The episode titled Know When to Fold 'Em focuses on David Dickerson's return to his Christian household that he had not visited since he left college. 10 years later, as a hostile 28-year-old, Dickerson wants to undermine his father's repressive faith. And on the show, David says, I had all this ammunition and I couldn't wait to use it. And I remember thinking, this is a showdown because my dad and I were at war. My dad knows this. My dad didn't know this, but I was at war with him. I was at war with all Christians, and I was just waiting for an excuse to have a shot. So when his father innocently mentioned some mission work he had been praying about, David unleashed his fury. I just rambled on like this, and I knew essentially while I was doing this, I was also assaulting his dream. Saying everything he was excited about, that he was sharing with me, was misbegotten, was a bad idea, was morally corrupt, and he just kind of quietly let me do my thing. David's father let him expend every round of ammunition without arguing or retreating. He simply looked at David and said, David, I'm really proud of everything you've done. David concluded the show by saying, and I remember looking at my dad and I thought, I had sort of expected to argue. Not to win, but to come to some kind of armistice, some kind of truce. I hadn't expected to lose completely because you can't argue with decency. You can't argue with goodness. There are few ways in this life you can reflect the image of Christ more than when you step into a difficult situation, when you step into the midst of conflict, and you show that person love instead of attacking them as they're attacking you. Few things in this world are going to show the world the love of Christ like that, and few things will transform your relationships than approaching difficult people in that way. As we close, let me just give you one more piece of encouragement, because my guess is in a room this size, some of you are sitting here this morning, and it's not that you're in the midst of a current conflict, but there's conflict in the past. And there's relationships that have been broken. And you're wondering, or maybe you've even given up on the idea that that relationship could ever be restored. Paul, Barnabas, and John Mark separate in Acts 15, but in 2 Timothy 4, Paul's near the end of his life. He's living out a prison sentence in a hole in the ground. And he's writing to the churches about what he needs. And look at what Paul writes in 2 Timothy 4:11, many years after Acts 15. Luke alone is with me. Get Mark and bring him with you, for he is very useful to me for ministry. And this relationship that seemed like it would never be repaired by the end of Paul's life, he's saying, please bring John Mark, I need him. And we see the power of the grace of God at work in Paul's life, at work in John Mark's life, restoring what was broken and giving us hope that if a relationship is broken now, it is not broken forever necessarily. And so are you praying for God to change hearts in that situation? Are you praying for God to help you love that person even when it's really difficult to love them and serve them? Are you doing what you can do to love them in the midst of the conflict? Because if you're willing to do that, you might be amazed at what God can do in what feels broken now. I'm going to pray and we'll sing.